Here's every board member's worst nightmare. Everything seems to be going smoothly when all of a sudden, a big project pops up and you don't have enough reserves to cover it. Now you're forced to hit the owners with an unwanted special assessment to get that project done. This nightmare is real and happens to associations all too often. So, how does a reserves roadmap help? In this portion of the webinar, we'll give you some examples to keep you from depleting your precious reserve funds on the wrong projects. And we'll show you how to avoid expensive detours, keeping reserve expenses from spiraling out of control. Part of this comes from understanding the journey a little bit better, helping you appreciate the different ways to face the 5 different types of reserve expenses, and how to respond when the expenses don't quite match the plan. And finally, we'll show you how your reserve study helps you identify your landmarks, so you can see if you're on track to have enough reserves, or if you need to make some course corrections. Thanks, Coley. We're making a lot of great progress here and a lot of application in that last section. Well, now let's get to some actual examples so our audience can make good decisions all through the year. And let's start with one of the most common issues. The question is if a project is a reserve expense or an operating expense.
That's a great question. I get this one all the time. It's probably one of the most asked questions. We cover that question in an entire webinar, our Reserve Studies 101 program, which you can find on our website or our YouTube channel. But let me summarize the answer in the next few slides. Think about it like this. There's a 3-part test that every reserve component must pass. That the item is a common area responsibility, that it can be reasonably anticipated, and that its cost is significant to the association. Every component in your reserve study needs to pass this 3-part test. But let's check back to the questions you face on a regular basis. How do you know if something is a reserve expense or an operating expense? Here's how it works. First, you look to see if the project is listed in the reserve study. If so, it's a reserve expense. If roof replacement is a line item in the reserve study, just cleaning the gutters on the roof doesn't make it as a reserve project. That's normal maintenance. Next, consider if the expense affects the component's useful remaining life. That means a minor service call to a boiler is not a reserve project, but replacing the igniter system that extends the boiler's remaining useful life by 5 years, that's a legitimate reserve expense. And finally, if it truly looks like a component was missed or was not knowable at the time of the last reserve study, check with your reserve study provider. They'll help you decide, preventing you from guessing. That's a good example of exercising your duty of inquiry from the business judgment rule. Here's another one. Look at this simple but typical reserve component list. All the normal things are here: description, useful life, remaining useful life, and current cost. Suppose your pool heater fails. You see a pool resurface component. See that second one on the list? But no pool heater component. From what you've just learned, replacing the pool heater, or pool filter for that matter, isn't automatically a reserve expense just because it's related to the pool. Check with your reserve study provider. There may be a reason it was excluded, or they may support the expenditure from reserves and add it to your component list in the next update. It's not in your best interest to guess. Too many properties gradually deplete their reserves by spending those limited funds on non-reserve projects.
And that's a real problem. Associations depleting reserves when they've worked so hard to gather what they do have. Okay, well, that helps properties not deplete the reserves by focusing on what are appropriate reserve expenses. But is there something boards and managers can do to help their properties actually save money?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we just talked about, most of your reserve decisions through the year are going to be spending choices. Hopefully, the funding plan is set at the beginning of the year, at budget season. We want to encourage you to spend reserves on the right projects at the right time. Spending reserves effectively avoids expensive deferred maintenance or even corrective maintenance, which is more costly than deferred maintenance. But not all reserve projects are the same. Projects fail differently. Some are okay to defer. Some you should rely on doing on a schedule. It's okay to defer an inconsequential component when cash is tight. It's okay to stop and not spend reserves and let that asset fail. That might be, say, a machine in the gym that nobody uses, or a water heater in the pool restroom. You can live without it for a little while, but you want to think twice and reevaluate obsolescence projects, doing the ones that have true merit for the association and deferring the not needed now projects. It's the protection and catastrophic projects that you want to make sure you do on time. Those are projects like wood paint and asphalt sealing that protect the underlying and very expensive wood or asphalt, or catastrophic projects like a hot water boiler for the building or an entry gate mechanism. Nobody wants those calls when there's no hot water. Don't delay on those. Those are the ones that will get real expensive or cause hardships if you delay. Stay in the green. Green means go. But just as a reminder, no deferred projects save the association any money. Those projects still need to be done. And you have to be careful deferring only the safe projects, because otherwise you'll just cost the owners a bunch of extra money. Contact your reserve provider if you have a question. This asphalt is a classic example of a poor decision. Here's a protection project, a board that delayed doing their protective asphalt seal coat, and as a consequence, the expensive underlaying driveway failed. Replacing the driveway cost them between 10 and 20 times the original cost of that seal project that they delayed. The same is true for this painting of the ironwork, right? It's all deteriorated and now has to be completely redone. Painting it could have given them additional time over the years. We also look at this when replacing a roof. Delaying protection or catastrophic projects are generally a bad idea. Unless you reached out to an expert and have been given advice that delaying is in the best case, okay. Everyone with me on this? Understanding that reserve projects are different. Give me a hands raised if you understand that some are okay to delay and some should really be done on time. Do I see any hands?
Yeah, Coley, that's a great point. Not all reserve projects are equal. Some are okay to delay, and some we really want to be doing on time. Okay, well, that's great, articulating those different 5 types of failures. But what about when the project matches, but the cost doesn't? What's someone to do there?
That's a good point. Well, first, just go ahead and do the project. Expect that the extra dollars will either come from other reserve projects or be redistributed to other projects. The asterisk here is to let you know that all this means is that it will automatically update when using the cash flow method. Then make sure your reserve study is updated with new information, making sure your reserve study is better each time it's done. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about it. Spend reserves. Get that project done and protect your property. Taking care of the property is more important than following your reserve study document. The reserve study is a budget planning tool. Do what needs to be done, and remember the 4 reserve rules. Delayed projects often get expensive, and that just makes things more expensive for the homeowners.
Okay, got that. But is it ever okay to make a project different or to upgrade a component, making it better when it gets replaced? Does that make it a capital improvement? Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Reserves are not for adding new assets to the association, like a new dock when one previously didn't exist, or a new pool when one previously didn't exist. That's the key. But if the asset needs to be replaced, it's totally fine to do a natural upgrade, like you see on the slide. Replacing an incandescent light with another light that uses electricity, like maybe an LED. Just remember, if the asset or project exists is the key distinction. Remember that reserves offset ongoing deterioration of existing assets. Reserves are not a slush fund to be used to buy new things for the association. If your board ever has a question on the issue, once again, reach out to your reserve study provider for clarification. We're here to help.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's now talk about money in reserves and the big question, if the association has enough. Now, like with components, we devote an entire webinar to this issue. It's called Reserve Studies 102, which again, you can find on our website or YouTube.
Yes. So the major point from that webinar is to measure reserve fund size by percent funded, not the cash balance. Champlain Towers South had about $700,000 in its reserve fund. That sounds like a lot of money, until you understand that they had so many reserve projects waiting to be done, they were only about 7% funded. Percent funded tells us how well the association meets the needs of the association. Remember that the cost of deterioration is ongoing. Percent funded reveals the result of that funding. If the resulting reserve balance has kept pace with the ongoing deterioration over the years, it's kind of like the world record pace line that you sometimes see in a swim race. It allows you to know how we're doing. It's important to note that you can be well funded now and have zero funding in a few years if you don't have a good funding plan. In a quick answer to the question about how associations are doing, if they have enough, about 2/3 or 66% of associations have reserves that fit the percent funded definition of being in the fair or strong range. But it's that 1/3 in the weak range that make all the news. This chart shows you why percent funded matters. This chart shows that you can predict most special assessments. You can see them coming in years in advance when you look at percent funded. See how common special assessments are in the red columns on the left side of the chart? When the association is in the 0 to 30% funded range, but special assessments are infrequent in most of the yellow zone and even rare in the green zone. It's pretty powerful information. This is great information for your board to know. Give me a hands raised if you can see how percent funded tells you if your association is prepared or unprepared for the upcoming expenses.
That might be a sobering question for many people here in the webinar today.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me take it one step further. When you've talked about what's in the reserve fund, now people are probably trying to think, well, what's it take to adequately fund reserves and offset ongoing deterioration, being prepared? And the answer is that it's often about 25% of total budget, like we show in this pie chart.
Yes. And why budgeted funding instead of special assessments? With budgeted funding, every owner pays their fair share of steady, ongoing deterioration over the time they owned a home in the association. The result is that the funds exist when they are needed. And remember, the future takes care of itself when you take care of adequate funding on an ongoing basis. Everybody pays their fair share. This is the magic of how associations avoid unfair special assessments and expensive deferred maintenance, which maximizes their property values. This is all part of your roadmap to success. Choosing your words and discussion points carefully is how curb appeal and property values are maximized. That's a successful strategy. Though some of you are probably distracted thinking your association isn't close to putting 25% of the total budget aside and wondering if that's even possible. But I'll tell you that reserve funding is not too expensive. Even 25% of the total budget often works out to be about the cost of a premium copy per day. That's very affordable. If someone says they can't afford it, they're just plain wrong. Besides, another fact is that budgeted reserve funding is the least expensive way to pay for reserve expenses. The expenses are driven by deterioration, not the budget. The only choice you have is how the owners will pay. With budgeted funding for a, say, $250,000 roof project, owners will pay less than $250,000 due to compound interest earned from a bank. A special assessment will pay for the expense. Well, the special assessment should cover a $200,000 roof, right? No. At current rates, it will take about $320,000 from owners to pay back a $250,000 loan. Like we've said plenty of times before in this webinar, delaying it usually gets expensive.
Okay, I've heard you say in here and what I see in the chart that budgeted funding is going to cost the owners less than a special assessment at the time of the expense, and that is less expensive than a loan. I get that. But can you offer now some help for boards or managers who need to significantly increase their reserve funding? How do they get started on that path to success, even if they are going through budgeted funding? And that seems like just a high ask for them.
Sure. Well, we call it a $10 solution. It likely took the association years or even decades to get into an underfunded jam. Check with your reserve study provider. You usually can take a few years to get out of that jam. Consider raising your reserve funding by $10 per owner per month this year. And then next year, $10 more per owner per month. And the following year. In just 2 to 5 years, that's usually all it takes to make associations raise their funding enough to be at a sustainable level.
Well, that sounds real doable. Thanks for sharing that. At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.